Good evening. Welcome. Welcome. My name is David Willett, Chair of the Foundation for Science and Technology. Thank you very much for being with us this evening, both in person and also a warm welcome to our online participants, and particularly for our online speakers. If you do want to put a question, do go to the website slido.com and then to the meeting number, which is 5378335. This is an important meeting on the subject of enhancing the UK's preparedness and resilience to climate change. We're delighted to be doing it in partnership with and with support from both the Physiological Society, who have done important work in this area, and also the Council for Science and Technology. The CST, not to be confused with the FST. We are linked by alliteration and a lot more, and it's great to be working with the CST. In fact, this may be our first explicit partnership event with them, and we greatly appreciate that opportunity. And indeed, unusually for us, there is a kind of set text, which is the CST letter. Of course, the CST is the government's top-level advisory body on science and technology issues, and they wrote to the Prime Minister on the 28th of October 2025, setting out some practical proposals in this area. We have excellent speakers. I will introduce each one of them when it's their turn to speak, but our opening speaker is absolutely the right person to set the ball rolling, Professor Jim Hall, who is Professor of Climate and Environmental Risks in the University of Oxford. He led the development of Britain's first national infrastructure systems model and has been closely involved in this advice as a member of the CST. Jim, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much indeed to the Foundation for Science and Technology for hosting this evening's event on the crucial topic of adaptation to climate change in the UK. Because as we all know, extreme events, floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires are impacting people's lives, infrastructure, the economy in this country and around the world. And we know from climate attribution studies that to a greater or lesser extent, the severity of those events is being driven by increasing carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. So if we're to avoid ever more dangerous climate change in the long run, those emissions must stop. Which is happening in the UK with vigorous action to decarbonise the power sector. And we just a few weeks ago heard that the world's largest emitter, China, their emissions has stabilised and begun to go down for a full year. But without relenting on emissions reduction, we need to adapt to the intensifying impacts of climate change. And that shouldn't be news. People have been talking about adaptation for a very long time. The UK's 2008 Climate Change Act obliged government to carry out a climate change risk assessment every 5 years, to produce a national adaptation plan, and it also created the adaptation subcommittee of the Committee on Climate Change, which monitors progress with adaptation. And in the meantime, we have seen action on adaptation. We've seen a number of adaptation policies and guidance and some significant investment, notably in flood risk management. There have been, thankfully, policy reforms to bring the risk of overheating in buildings into building regulations. There's been commitment to new reservoirs as well as action on water demand and leakage to help to address the risks of droughts. But progress is patchy. and there have been more policy commitments than there have been changes on the ground. Adaptation seems to have slipped down the agenda as a political priority. And that's why the Council for Science and Technology, the CST, has written to the Prime Minister with this new advice on adaptation. By way of background, the CST provides independent advice to the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers on key issues relating to science and technology, priorities for science and technology, the health of the science and technology ecosystem, and some horizon scanning around emerging science and technology developments. The government's chief scientific advisor, Dame Angela McLean, co-chairs CST and has made this fiscal year her year of adaptation. And in a moment, you'll hear from Anjali Goswami, CSA in DEFRA, about Dame Angela's priorities for her year of adaptation, which are, as you might expect, well aligned with CST's advice. In its advice to the Prime Minister, CST is always very careful to be specific and actionable, to advise on what parts of government should be responsible for the recommended action. So, having examined the many things that could be said about adaptation, but also the steps that have already been taken and what the remaining gaps are, the CST arrived last October at 4 recommendations for the Prime Minister. And recommendation 1 addresses adaptation targets. Adaptation means physical things happening on the ground. It's not just to do with policies and plans. And we know that targets drive action within government. And they're especially important for adaptation because adaptation involves so many different things across different parts of government, as well as across government agencies and the devolved nations of the United Kingdom. We've tried adaptation without targets for many years, and it's not working. And in the areas where we have had targets, notably in flood risk management, where there have been targets to reduce the number of homes at risk from flooding, we're seeing more investment and more focus on delivery. Another instance of positive targets relates to drought resilience. The National Infrastructure Commission recommended that the water resource system should be resilient to a 1 in 500-year drought. That standard was accepted by the water industry and regulators, and that's what's driving this extra action on new reservoirs, water transfers, leakage, and demand management. Of course, we all know that targets need to be handled with care. A kind of myopic focus on targets can distract attention from the rest of the system, and we also know that adaptation is place-specific. So we have to be careful about a one-size-fits-all approach to targets. But the CST concluded, as did the Committee on Climate Change, that adaptation targets are needed to help people understand what needs to be done and when. Recommendation 2 relates to how we measure adaptation, how we measure those actual things which are going on the ground. It's not just enough to have policies or indeed to spend money. Something has to change in order to reduce the risk from climate change. That might sound fairly obvious, so it's perhaps surprising that we don't have a complete account of the risk-reducing benefit that 20 years of adaptation in this country has achieved. CST recommended that the government, specifically the Cabinet Office, should develop a monitoring dashboard that actually records adaptation actions and measures their benefits in terms of climate risk reduction. And here's some of the concept for that. So central to this is risk information, hazards, climate scenarios, the sectors which may be impacted by climate change under different socioeconomic scenarios. But additional, and this is the missing link, is that information around what adaptation has actually occurred, when, how much did it cost, how has it been maintained, what condition it's in, what are the co-benefits. And for combinations of those variables, one can then pull them together into maps. CST wanted this to be spatial so that local stakeholders can see what's going on, time series and charts. The risk analysis involved modeling, and that's never going to be completely accurate, so it's important that we actually sense check this with what's happened, what impacts have occurred on the ground. That in itself is going to have a bit of scatter to it, but it helps us to ground our risk assessments and to answer these crucial questions which we can't answer at the moment around what adaptation has happened, how much has it cost, how effective has it been at getting risk down. Adaptation will never reduce the risk of climate change to zero. Residual risk is the risk that's left after adaptation. And even in a system as reliable as the Thames Barrier, there is a residual probability of failure, even though that number is small at the moment. So it's not enough just to deliver protection against climate change. Adaptation also encompasses strategies to deal with the residual risk that it's not cost effective to protect against, and a commitment to rapid repair and recovery. And that actually is the essence of resilience. It's the capacity of a system to resist, to cope, to recover, and to build back better. And from our inquiries, CST resolved that there needs to be much better analysis of residual risks and a more systematic approach to responding to them. Government can't afford to protect everywhere, but systems to warn, cope with emergencies, and recover should be available everywhere. And finally, CST couldn't find out who in government is actually responsible for communicating climate risks and the need for adaptation. The Met Office does a tremendous job in communicating weather and climate science, and actually mainstream media in this country is pretty good at that. But that's quite different to communicating the climate risks to which people are exposed and the steps that they should be taking to do anything about it, as well as the adaptation that's already going on. And that's why the CST recommended that there should be a much more purposeful approach to communicating climate risks. And for people to pay attention, our recommendation was that that should be the responsibility of number 10. Now, as ever, number 10 has a lot on its plate, but it's just because there's so much going on politically in this country and around the world that we're worried that the crucial challenge of climate adaptation is not getting enough attention. The good news is that adaptation is something that we know how to do. We don't need to invent new technologies. Technological innovation has a lot to offer, but what we need to do is get on with carefully measuring climate risk, establishing priorities, doing adaptation on the ground, managing the residual risk, and communicating so that everyone knows what's going on and what their responsibilities are. And that, in a nutshell, is what CST has recommended to the Prime Minister should be happening to adapt the UK to the impacts of climate change.
Great, thank you very much. A great start with that very clear account of the 4 recommendations from the CST. Thank you very much for that, Jim. We're now going to hear from Professor Anjali Goswami. She is Chief Science Advisor and Director General Science at DEFRA. She's a research leader in evolutionary biology, an honorary professor at UCL, and past president of the Linnaean Society of London. So over to Anjali.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you to talk about a topic that is incredibly important and certainly one that occupies a lot of my attention since coming into this role, and hopefully will increasingly occupy everyone's attention across the country. So as we all know, climate risks to the UK are growing, and the impacts are already being felt. We see this throughout the year in all different sectors. We are seeing hotter and drier summers, wetter winters, increasing pressure on our water and food systems, and rising vulnerability across nature, communities, and critical infrastructure. So by the end of this century, the UK is expected to see far more extreme weather, and quite frankly, well before then. The record-breaking 40 degrees Celsius temperatures that we experienced in July 2022 are no longer outliers. Under a medium emissions scenario, they could occur every 15 to 20 years, and under a high emissions scenario, they could occur every 3 to 4 years. Now, we also face a rising likelihood of extreme rainfall, with events like the October 2020 downpours becoming up to 10 times more likely by 2100. And I think anybody who has been in the UK over the last few months feels like that is, increasingly the case, certainly. Now, sea levels will continue to rise around the UK under all emission scenarios, and this is a problem especially in the south, where land is subsiding alongside rising sea levels. Now, recent Met Office research shows that the chance of exceeding 40 degrees Celsius is already around 20 times higher than it was in the 1960s, and that will continue to rise, of course, as climate warms. It's important to recognize that these changes will not occur gradually. This is not going to be a very linear rise over the next decades. It is likely that these extreme years with multiple climate shocks are likely to cluster. Their timing and severity will vary across the UK's regions and systems, and this makes adaptation not only prudent, but essential. So adaptation must now sit at the heart of long-term national planning. And I want to be clear that this doesn't mean that we're giving up on mitigation, and many people feel that that is the case when we talk about climate adaptation, that we're basically saying we're not going to hit our net zero targets, we are not going to try to limit future climate change. That is absolutely not what we are saying when we say we have to adapt. We will continue to work very hard and commit ourselves and continue to recommit ourselves to hitting those targets. But even if we hit all those targets, we are going to be living in a warmer world, right? And so this is why we absolutely have to be thinking and talking about climate adaptation and working towards it. Now, the science is clear. We need earlier action, we need better coordination, and we need policy that recognizes both current risks and those that are on the horizon. Evidence is evolving quickly, and part of our role as chief science advisors across the various government departments is to ensure that ministers receive timely and actionable insight. Now, this means not only providing data, but interpreting and translating it into strategic choices. And this isn't always easy, because of course there's always short-term pressures, and adaptation can sometimes feel like something that is very far away. But in fact, we can see that adaptation is needed now, in the near term as well as in the long term. So DEFRA is working across government, as well as with the GCSA and with her year of adaptation, really focusing attention on this issue. We're working to reset the UK's approach to climate adaptation. Our priorities include establishing stronger objectives, clarifying roles and responsibilities, because we need accountability if we are actually going to see progress in this area, improving monitoring and governance, and supporting departments to convert evidence into real-world action, because talk is never going to be enough in this space, and we need to move quickly. Now, the government has committed to setting more ambitious adaptation objectives as we move towards the 4th National Adaptation Program in 2028. and we have high ambitions for that program. DEFRA is supporting departments across Whitehall to develop clear and measurable adaptation objectives and delivery plans for each of the 14 systems identified in the 4th Climate Change Risk Assessment. And that working across government is really critical, because natural systems do not work in silos. They don't respect the boundaries between departments or one person's job versus another person's job. We need to be thinking about this in a systems way, as opposed to following the silos that maybe historically have been in place. So working across government is absolutely critical, and it's something that we are very focused on doing. NAP4 is a really critical moment. It's going to bring together the science, the policy, and the operational preparedness that we need in order to tackle this challenge. It's an opportunity to strengthen standards, embed resilience in investment decisions, and ensure that every department understands its adaptation responsibilities. Because, as I said, it is going to take everybody working together to make sure that we are prepared for this warmer, wetter world. Science will determine the credibility of the NAP, ensuring that it is rigorous, realistic, and oriented towards the future. And we are really committed to making sure that it is good enough to help us make sure that we are prepared for the future. Now, this year, the GCSA's Year of Adaptation put adaptation firmly at the center of the government science agenda. And although I have not been in government that long, I can see that it is certainly being discussed far more so than before, and hopefully many of you have also felt the same. And it provides that shared focus on understanding the risk, identifying the systemic vulnerabilities, and raising ambitions on preparedness. And what's critical is that we make sure that people understand how it directly will impact the sectors that they are most closely allied to, so that we can see how we need to prepare and what we need to do now. Now, alongside all of this, on the policy and operational side, we are also advancing the Climate Adaptation Research and Innovation Framework, which represents a new approach to identifying and addressing priority research and innovation needs. So Go Science and the CSAs work closely together to identify the highest priority areas for CARIF delivery. But I really want to emphasize that R&D cannot be used as a way to delay action. And very often, if we're all honest, it is used in that way, that we don't know enough, and so we have to wait to do more research before we can act. We do need more research. There are certainly areas that have critical investigatory needs, where we need to understand not just what might happen, but what is the best way of tackling that. So there is a strong research need across all the sectors that we're concerned with. But we know enough to start acting now, and so we must. Now, a core strength of the CSA network is that ability, as I said, to see across the departmental boundaries, so we can map those interdependencies across systems, such as water, such as energy, environment, and health, nature, and infrastructure. All of these coalesce in this area. Now, we provide independent challenge also to government and ensure that the decisions reflect the best available evidence rather than short-term pressures. And that is a part of my job that I take very seriously, and if I'm honest, I really enjoy. Not just telling ministers what they're interested in, but actually what they need to be thinking about. And that is a really important part of our role. That means that we help government anticipate emerging risks rather than just responding to them after they occur. I should say also that I view our jobs as CSAs as beyond just government. Because we are essentially outsiders brought into government for the most part, we sit at the interface between government and the rest of the world. Academia for the most part, but certainly the private sector and other areas. And this challenge of climate adaptation cannot be just for government. Government must lead, but it will involve everybody participating and taking this seriously and investing in climate adaptation. So we need the private sector, we need higher education institutions, we need the general public to be working with us on this. Everybody has to take some responsibility for a well-adapted UK. Now, strengthening the UK's climate resilience is a shared endeavor, as I said, but science does give us that clarity, foresight, and confidence. Clarity to take action now, foresight to plan for what is coming, and confidence to make long-term decisions that will protect people, nature, and the economy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anjali, and thank you also for your account of how the role of the Chief Science Advisor fits into this debate, and it was very illuminating and appreciated. Now, we understand that Professor Saminsky is running late, and unless she has arrived at the back, I think we're going to have to move on from Professor Saminsky, and hope she is able to join us. So let's now go to Professor Mike Tipton, who is a human and applied physiologist based at the Extreme Environments Laboratory at the University of Portsmouth. He works in practical areas where physiology and climate adaptation come together, and he is president of the Physiological Society, chair of the National Water Safety Forum, and Water Safety England. Over to you.
Lord Willits, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak this evening. And we've heard the term impact quite a lot, but it's been mostly in the context of the impact on infrastructure. And what I would like to do is just talk to you about the human component of that and try and justify this particular poster here, which says climate resilience depends on physiology. So let's go to the side. So I'm going to say and just discuss a little bit about how physiology and an understanding of the human context in climate adaptation can influence a slightly different approach to this. So just so that you know, physiology is the science of how the body works from cell to whole body, and therefore it's involved in maintaining function, health, comfort, well-being, and recovery from stresses. And that's physiological resilience, and therefore it's not an enormous leap to go from physiological resilience as a core component of climate resilience. And we've already heard about many of the things on this slide, and so when I talk about physiology in this context, I'm not talking about an increase in the number of pandemics due to new viruses. I'm actually talking about the impact of environmental extremes and stresses on physiological strain within the body, and arguing why that should be a component of what we consider when we consider infrastructure adaptation. So rising temperatures, air pollution, extreme events, as we've heard, all increasing. Add to that the need for food and water safety and sustainable nutrition. And it's not just the impact on health in the general terms, it's an impact also on functionality and mental health. Now, I don't want to frighten you with this, but this is just one example of what we can bring to the debate. So I work quite a lot in cold and heat, and this is a model of your thermoregulatory system, and we want to be in this bit here. So this bit here is where you're controlling your body temperature just by sending more or less blood to the skin. So you're not sweating and you're not shivering. And I will guarantee that if you are sitting there this evening comfortable, then you will be in that region, and you will have a mean skin temperature within 0.5 of a degree of 33 degrees Celsius. You will have a chest temperature of 35 degrees Celsius. You'll have a hand or foot temperature around about 25 degrees Celsius, and a deep body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. And what you've done, and what humans have done by building buildings, heating them, cooling them, wearing clothes, is recreated next to your skin the environment in which we evolved. So that's the typical environment you would have if you were in East, Southeast Africa, naked in 26 to 28 degrees Celsius. And that's where we're comfortable. That's where we're happiest. That's where we have the greatest well-being. As we start to move outside of that, and you start to sweat, that's a threshold. And that's a threshold for discomfort, because just the function of sweating makes you less comfortable, as does the function of shivering. As you get hotter, either because you're required to work in those environments or because they're getting hotter and hotter, the heat waves are getting warmer and warmer, then you have to sweat more and more in order to try and remain in a zone where you can control deep body temperature. And eventually you exhaust that capability. You're sweating now at around about 2 liters of sweat per hour. You're rapidly becoming dehydrated, and you move outside of any ability to control body temperature. So now you're moving towards hypothermia and heat illness, and that's a limit. So that is just by way of introducing the concept of thresholds and limits. And we know them, and we also know how they change with adaptation the way I define it, which is acclimatization to heat or acclimation to heat. And we also know that this kind of group have different levels of susceptibility. They're vulnerable groups. And when we think about particularly heat, but other stresses as well, we tend to think about vulnerability in terms of the number of deaths of particularly elderly individuals during heat waves, and that's always quoted. However, there are also a whole list of other people who are vulnerable in this situation, and they include people who have to go and work in hot environments wearing PPE, or have to work in places like hospitals and care homes, where the temperatures are higher for the people who are there, but the people who have to work in that environment are uncomfortably hot. The other point to make about this is this covers various government departments, because it doesn't only involve health, it also includes work, productivity, all of which will be impacted as the human moves from here, either up that line or up that line with cold snaps or heat waves. Okay, that's the physiology lesson over, you'll be pleased to hear. So coming back to the CST recommendations that we already heard, we've seen the first one is about setting adaptation targets that protect people. So I'll put it to you that it would be worthwhile having physiological thresholds anchoring those targets in terms of human tolerance. If you say, oh, what's the risk? Well, what do we mean by that? For me, we mean the risk of a human moving into a range where either they've crossed a threshold, or worse still, they've got to a limit of what they can tolerate in terms of pollution, in terms of heat, in terms of cold, in terms of other stressors. So having a human health-centered threshold risk-based policy rather than just environmental averages. So the next one. Yeah, so this one is to do with tracking climate risks where it harms people. And that can be linked to human functionality, and it can show where those thresholds I've just discussed with you are being breached. And it's not just a matter of saying, well, temperatures are rising and we've kept them down a bit. And it can turn the dashboard that we've heard about into a decision-making tool, because it can help to prioritize where we're most exceeding thresholds and most exceeding risks, and where we're achieving keeping them under control. So including physiological-based indicators of human harm and function and the impact in the climate risk dashboard, not just hazard exposure. Defining the limits of adaptation. So physiological limits show where adaptation has achieved what it's setting out to achieve, or how far it is away from that achievement. And in such, again, it helps prioritize areas where more input is required, or areas where success has been achieved. And that includes not just for health, this is talking about health and safety and productivity. So establish a cross-government, for the reasons I said in terms of particularly the vulnerable people, a cross-government framework that defines residual climate risk in relation to physiological limits, and clarifying where adaptation cannot fully protect people. That's infrastructure adaptation. Finally, as somebody who gets wheeled out onto the media every time there's either a cold snap or particularly a heat wave, and I can tell you that people, when you communicate to them about these temperatures, are much more switched on to it when you talk to them in terms of the impacts on their body. If you talk to them about overheating, you talk to them about dehydration, you talk to them about not going out for your run at lunchtime when it's 40 degrees Celsius, and you talk to them about how to mitigate some of those problems, cooling, how to change your house, etc., etc. So I think that there's another function here for physiological interpretation in terms of communicating climate risk and using those physiological impacts in terms of risks, symptoms, and recovery and protective actions in terms of helping people understand what those numbers in terms of climate translate to in terms of their day-to-day lives. That's all I wanted to say. If you are interested in what I've just said and you want to find out some more, go and have a look at the Physiological Society website, where you'll find lots more information of the type I've just given you. And you'll also, I've also put this on. This is another area of work that the Physiological Society are particularly interested in with our ageing population, and that's growing old and getting better, because that's all part of climate resilience. If you don't have a population that are fit, healthy, well-nourished, then these impacts will be greater. So it's all part of a much bigger integrated system. And my final plea is that if you're going to continue to debate in this area, have a physiologist on your committee. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mike, and thank you for linking climate change to the human condition in such a vivid way. Yes, so you have made your case. Now we're going to hear from Rachel Kite, who was appointed UK Special Representative for Climate in October 2024. She's Professor of Practice in Climate Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford and was previously Special Representative of the UN Secretary General and CEO of Sustainable Energy for All. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much to the Foundation. Thank you to everybody involved in this event for inviting me. It's one of the rare weeks that I'm in town, and I'm very pleased to be here. And thank you for the clarity and the manner of delivery of the advice. I mean, it was clear, it's actionable, and so now it's up to government to respond. And of course, we've got chief scientists here as well, so this is a shared endeavour. I just want to make a few points, sort of setting this work in its context, both domestically and internationally. So I am politically appointed and report to the Foreign Secretary and to the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, and then sort of run around and annoy other departments of government as well. And so when I read the advice, it landed with me very clearly, because I do think that one of the areas where the government is challenged at the moment is on the centripetal force that's needed in order to sort of pull the whole of government approach together across the entirety of the resilience and adaptation agenda. So first of all, you don't need me really to tell you that the narrative for action on climate change has suffered some serious blows recently, with the sort of weaponization of terminology that we use to describe, mainly perhaps on the mitigation side of things, on the need to reduce emissions. But also sort of, I think we need to learn lessons about the clarity of language and the language which actually helps to connect to people. I think the point of the previous speaker around how you talk to people about their own physiology and how they experience extreme heat or they experience extreme weather events is very important. I think it's also important for me to say that this is orchestrated, this is well funded, this is this attack on sort of the terminology of climate change and the urgency and the importance of it. This isn't a dispute of your forefathers' years. This is a full-on, well-intentioned disruption around a transition which is inevitable and underway and is being imported quite clearly into this country. And so what do we do about that? Because this is, as somebody who lived in the United States for more than 20 years, coming back to teach at Oxford, but also to do this job, this is around undermining our faith in expertise, both the kind of expertise in this room, but also the expertise that's found within a community. doubting indigenous knowledge as well as, and casting aspersions on it, as well as that scientific research and knowledge which many of you represent. It is a deliberate attempt to pick at and fray the fabric that holds communities and countries together in order to pursue the objectives of those who fund this campaign. So I'm here to say that, helping your work land in such a way with government and with Parliament and with all of those in positions of authority is not a given, and is something that we all have to work on collectively. This question of the role that science, or the interrelationship between science, its findings, its evidence, and then policymakers, and then how policymakers take that and take the responsibility for communicating that. I mean, I think too often we still hear, that scientists need to communicate their science better. Well, actually, there needs to be a leaning in from the policymakers in terms of taking the time to understand the science in a policy environment, and then to explain why the policy decisions are being made the way they are. And then, as you recommended, some very important points on communication and the empowerment of people to take that data, take the communication and do something with it. So these are all areas where I think as government and governing at the moment pose real challenges, because it's not taking place in a neutral environment. As I travel around the world, one of the surefire things that people want from us is our know-how. And what they want is our institutional and statutory know-how. How did you create the CCC? How does it work? How have you managed to protect it? How does it continue to work, even in an environment where we've now seen a fragmentation of the bipartisan support around the Climate Act, etc.? The excellent work that they produce is watched world over, right? So it's not just landing and being important here. It is also anchoring how other countries think about how they can build processes and systems that mean that they can aspire to having the kind of national adaptation processes that we have, or the carbon budgets that we have, for example. And I think that we underestimate that in a world where our economic outreach is somewhat weaker than it was before, where our growth is posing a struggle, and where we've cut our overseas development assistance, our soft power in terms of the institutions we have, the ways we know how to work, the way we know how to leverage the academy, the way we know how to leverage other parts of UK Inc. This is what actually other countries are desperate to find out what our secret sauce is, because they need that very much for their own journeys. And so the recent work on adaptation and resilience of the Climate Change Committee, I think, needs to land with government in a way that it rises back up the sort of list of the to-do list and becomes slightly more urgent. And I think one of the things that I think about a lot of the time is, where do we manufacture the urgency from? Nothing can be urgent all the time, because you sort of start to glaze over and the eyes start to roll back, because there's so many things that need urgent attention. But we do have to keep that up there, because otherwise, in just the act of governing, it will slip down the list again. And so helping this work land, I think, is a work for all of the chief scientific advisors, but also for me and my colleagues as well. We are 20 years into Nick Stern's famous review, and his famous phrase that the cost of inaction is more than the cost of action. And we have to admit that as an international community and as a society, we have resolutely failed to really internalise that. We still look at short-term costs rather than at long-term investments, value, wealth, and all of these concepts. And so I think this really impinges on the adaptation and resilience agenda. This is an investment in the future, and we are going to have to still fight that battle in context of spending reviews, etc., etc. And I think that how we do that will also make a big difference to how this work is carried forward. We talked about infrastructure. We've also talked about people, two elements of resilience. I think nature is also very important, because that provides us with the absolute security that we can build resilience going forward. So my final point, really, I'm running out of time, is around how we engage people and how we talk to people about resilience, but how we listen to people's own observation about what is concerning them, about their households, their communities, about their country. Because this is where I think the need for responses, proper responses to your letter and to the care of the work that you've done, this I think is going to be very important, because we are going to break open somehow a very centralised politics which is very much Westminster centred. This is not going to help us become a resilient country, a set of resilient communities. It is the communities that have to discuss which assets they want to protect and which assets they're prepared to let go. It is families that will have to have those conversations. It is then linking up the institutions which are important within communities, whether those be mosques and churches and synagogues, or whether those be community associations or garden clubs, etc. This is going to be, and this is the lesson that we can see from those communities that we would consider to be more resilient than not when we look around the world and we look for best practice. And not mentioned yet, but I'm sure underneath all of the PowerPoint slides, is the differentiation by gender. Right? So we know that in certain communities, the backbone of the resilience comes from the way that women connect with each other, because their lives are different from men's. And we have to be able to look at the woman's body differently from the male body in physiology, but we have to understand who's playing what role in the community. So the last thing I would like to say is that you often hear in government that we need to lead. What I hear in my job is other countries praying and hoping and asking us to continue to lead in what is a very fractious time, at a time when our oldest ally is now an unreliable ally, and at a time when we have to cleave back to Europe, and where we have to build a sphere of influence with Africa, and where we have to be able to work with those countries that want to move forward on this journey of both mitigation and adaptation, learning from each other and redefining partnership. And so what I hear from other countries is, please, can the United Kingdom be still that pragmatic partner, be good at listening as at telling, being the good partnership, whether that's university partnerships or civil society partnerships or financial partnerships, business partnerships or partnerships from government. And we are needed and wanted, and what they need and want is the humility to sort of say, well, we tried this and it worked. We tried this and it didn't. We don't have all the answers, but we will be with you every step of the journey as we try to build a more sustainable society. Thank you. I can sit next to the physiologist. How are you?
Good. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. And I must say, as you were talking, I was reminded, thinking back almost 20 years, when I was in the Shadow Cabinet, and Peter Ainsworth and David Cameron, in opposition, worked absolutely on a cross-party basis with the then Labour government, and to establish the Climate Change Committee. And that is a reminder of how this issue can be conducted on a cross-party basis, and the more it is so, the better. So now we're going to move to questions, and I'm actually going to call up one of the questions put online, because it does identify an issue that is hanging over the debate. I know people will argue that it's moved on, but I'm going to start with Jim. And the question is, how can we ensure adaptation work is not seen as giving up on the climate? This endless argument whether adaptation and focusing so much on adaptation is somehow undermining efforts on tackling climate change and mitigation. Do you want to just comment on that issue, Jim, which has been upvoted amongst our online participants?
Yeah, thank you. The adaptation, obviously, and mitigation are different, and we're confronting the impacts of climate change now, And however hard we mitigate, we're not going to eliminate the risks that we're facing now and will continue to face into the future. So adaptation is absolutely essential, as was said in the Stern report. In many senses, it's an act of self-interest. One is reducing risks and impacts which one's going to face in any case, and you're trying to do that in a reasonably proportionate way. I think possibly the harder version of the argument is, well, if we can adapt, then why should we mitigate? In particular, as the mitigation we're doing now is to avoid impacts which will accumulate as we go into the future. But what climate science tells us is that if we don't mitigate, if we go on to the higher emissions trajectories, there's the possibility of not only steadily increasing global mean temperatures and even faster increasing extremes, but also major tipping points within the Earth system, slowing down of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, for example, which could lead to radically different climate conditions in this country, actually much colder and drier here, much hotter in other parts of the world. I mean, these are versions of climate change which we really have to mitigate to avoid.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, of course.
So I absolutely agree with the last point in particular, that, well, all of them, but a 4-degree warmer world is much worse than a 2-degree warmer world. And so we really must do all we can to limit the amount of global warming that we experience. And so we must continue to be committed to mitigation. I think one aspect of adaptation that is perhaps sometimes underappreciated is that adaptation will also help with mitigation. A lot of the solutions that we look at in terms of adaptation, especially the nature-based solutions, actually will benefit our mitigation efforts and help us live more sustainably going forward. And so they're not an either-or. They both must happen, and they both will benefit from positive action on both mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you. I'm going now, Mike. I'm going to add an extra question, which I think is particularly apposite for you. The question is: should the physiological impacts of climate change be more directly linked to economic productivity?
Yes. Yes. I mean, the thing about it, I think I said when I spoke, that the trouble is we tend to, in terms of the human aspect of climate change, we think about new viruses, etc., and new pandemics. But when we talk about climate impact direct, we tend to think about people dying from heat. But there's an awful lot of work gone on, European-funded studies showing the significant impact on productivity and profitability caused by warming occupational environments. Now, that may be a more powerful argument in some quarters in terms of promoting, I agree, absolutely mitigation, but also adaptation to try and buy some more time. So yes, the short answer is yes.
Thank you very much. Rachel?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when the state of Florida was given the opportunity, when the State House was given the opportunity to vote in favour of labour regulations that would allow farm workers to start earlier in the day and take a break in the middle of the day and then work into the evenings, and it was rejected by the State House, the private sector was not happy, because the private sector knew exactly what it was losing by having to have a workforce that couldn't work. So, and I could give you 10, 20, 30 different examples of that around the world. So yes, the productivity cost is of extreme heat is probably the thing that is concentrating minds more than anything else. And I just say, because of Michael's presentation, is what my experience is that most governments have very, very ropey data on sort of morbidity, mortality related to extreme heat, as just one example. And they are very nervous. I mean, they need better data, but they're also very nervous about then anybody really getting to know about that data because the response measures are not in place. So, there's reasons why, a state minister in a state in India or the central government in India or anywhere else for that matter, it would be extremely nervous to really uncover the morbidity risks that they're already running and the impacts they're already running. And this is going to be one thing that really occupies, I think, health planners and others going forward.
So do you want to
Yes, there's one other aspect in terms of cost, in that one of the ways of addressing that issue of a warmer work environment, and we've done work, for example, on people who have to go in after floods and rescue people wearing dry suits on a day like we have today, and their estimated survival time in terms of heat is about 45 minutes. And the only way around that is to employ more people, because you can do work rest scheduling then where people aren't exposed for so long. So it's not just a decrease in productivity, it's an increase in employment costs in order to try and get the work rest scheduling working in a way that you can keep people, keep output going.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Right, now let's collect 2 or 3 questions here from our physical participants. I see a couple here at the front, and if you could give your name and organisation, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
Pardon me. John Dewdney, formerly of the British Antarctic Survey. And the question really is for Professor Tipton. I found your exposition fascinating. It's the first time I've heard such a close link between human physiology and climate change in that way. And as a practical suggestion, I wonder whether the Met Office should also have a physiological report, a physiological forecast associated with extreme weather events in a much more detailed way than they do now, just to alert people what the risks and dangers are.
Thank you. Yes, there's another question nearby. Yeah.
Bernie Balkan. One thing that was mentioned in passing almost was sea level rise. I only heard it mentioned once by him. But there's nothing that we can do, just as the UK, that will alleviate sea level rise, stop it, mitigate it at all. And it's even if we stopped all emissions today, it would continue to happen for a long time. Is this an example, to use what Rachel said, of us as a society having to decide what we're going to give up over the next 25 years? And is there anything that we can do which will adapt to sea level rise?
Right, and then there was another question, yes, at the far end of that row. And thank you.
Thank you. Emma Howard-Boyd. I led the London Climate Resilience Review for the Mayor of London, and I was chair of the Environment Agency, so done a lot of work on flooding. I'm assuming you haven't had a reply to the letter of October 25th that the recommendations were set out in. Is that correct?
We have had a reply, yeah, but it hasn't been published yet.
It's not.
Well, that's good to know, because I was wondering if it takes 4 months to get a reply from a letter such as that, what more further voices we need to put into the urgency of the issues that we're discussing here tonight. So I look forward to seeing the full response to that letter, because I think it's really important that it gets put into the public domain. But I am also wondering how we can use the private sector's voice, particularly those of investors, who only last week were calling out about increased flood risk and policy around new home building, so building in areas already of flood risk, when they are also putting large sums of money on the table to invest in the UK's infrastructure and renewable strategy. Is there more muscle that the investment community can be exercising to make sure that the policy framework moves at pace? Thank you.
Right. Let's start with Rachel and move along the panel that way.
So on sea level rise, yes. So there are I mean, small examples in the UK already, right? But large-scale examples in other countries where the cost of seawalls and other protection mechanisms versus a community-oriented conversation about, you know, is it just too expensive to protect this this village, this county? In the case of Vietnam, it's a whole area sort of south of Ho Chi Minh City. You know, this is the conversation that's going on, obviously, for small island states as well. So, yeah, and so the question then is, where do you start that conversation? Who has the conversation and who's in the room? And there's lots of experience from disaster relief work, actually, on how to help the community identify the assets which are the most important to them. And then how to build a conversation around that, and how to build, I mean, and you can go back to like Hurricane Katrina and some of the work that happened in the 9th parish of New Orleans. So these are examples that we can learn from. There are also mechanisms of citizens' assemblies and others which are, you know, used in these kinds of things, so more later. I would just say on the private sector, I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know, I don't understand all of the issues around publishing these letters and all the rest of it. I think there's some work that the committee has to do, but it's a short read. So I think that you can imply from that what you want. But the issue is, I think that we are going to have to find a way for the private sector, for this community and others to come together in a fairly clear way, I think, to push action with the kind of urgency that I think we all need, because it's just going to get more expensive.
Yeah. Mike, and I'm going to add again, because your physiological point has prompted quite a few comments online as well. So I'm going to add...
Not angry comments.
Well, no, people are intrigued. The question that has been upvoted a lot is, how do physiological risks of a hotter climate compared to the reduced risk of less extreme cold winters, which already kill many vulnerable people each year? So you might want to just cover that in your comment as well.
I will. Okay, so let's take the one I can, before I forget, because it was a long while ago, the question on Antarctic and the weather forecasting. And I mean, it's not just because I'm sitting here as president of the Physiological Society that I'm going to agree with you. There should be more physiology on the weather forecast. But I also say that because people are interested in their bodies, I mean, and how they work and how they don't work. I don't know anybody who's not interested in that. And if you can contextualize, as I mentioned in my talk, what things like, you know, a humidity and a temperature combination mean in terms of how you're going to feel and what you should and shouldn't do, or when it's cold, a wind chill index, then I think that's really important. On the point, one of the things you're going to see in some places, and we do lots of work wearing the National Water Safety Forum hat with Bangladesh, where they have 19,000 drownings a year, and they're getting worse. And you're just going to see population shifts. That's going to be the consequence of it. And where they're going to go and how they're going to be accepted, we're not getting very good vibes about that at the moment. So I don't understand where that's going to go, but it could end up in not a good place. So in the UK, incidentally, we lose 5,000 years of life lost every year to drowning. 8,000 years of life lost because it's young people. So the hot and cold bit. Yeah. So yes, in theory, I mean, people push this thing forward that you lose more lives in the winter than you do in the summer. Therefore, climate change is good. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. So you'll still obviously lose the deaths due to the heat, and that'll get worse, and that'll influence and affect more people. But the cold-related deaths would occur at a much warmer temperature anyway. So the fact that it might be -10 rather than -12 doesn't change that number. Those deaths are primarily driven by a vasoconstriction, that shutdown in the peripheral blood flow, which then has consequences for circulation, cardiac strain, likelihood of thrombosis. And really, being 8 degrees too low is not much better than being 10 degrees too low.
Okay, and Johnny?
Sure. Well, I'll just add on that point also, it's not just a shift a few degrees warmer, it's the extreme. So we will get more extreme weather in both directions, and not just a shift to slightly higher. So you will still have these very harsh winters, and certainly in some cases that will be worse. So picking up on a few points, I think on the coastal side, and in the situation in terms of rising seas and what we're doing to mitigate those, because those are things that will not stop in the near term. We are certainly investing very heavily in coastal resilience in this country, helping coastal communities prepare and adapt to this new reality. And we're also joining up with countries around the world. So certainly I'm on the board of the All-Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance, and one of the key areas of focus is on coastal communities. Now, it's not just about the infrastructure of those communities also. It's also about the livelihoods. So alongside rising temperatures, we also see ocean acidification as a result of global warming. And that is obviously changing the fisheries and the economic, the source of income for a lot of these communities. And so it's also about thinking how we can support communities to shift their economies, fish differently, to make sure that they can continue to have livelihoods in this new world. So there's quite a lot happening in those areas, absolutely, both nationally, well, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. I absolutely agree with the point on the private sector. We have to be working across all sectors, and I think the private sector can do a huge amount to bring attention to this issue. I think that investing in things over a few decades, so infrastructure for a few decades that isn't fit for a future environment, and not even that far into the future at this point, is not a wise investment. I would love to see the private sector really engaging with that and pushing that alongside government. And then finally, I also wanted to talk a little bit about silos. I think the comment about whether the Met Office should be putting out a physiology report. Well, they do in air pollution. We get air pollution reports. We get pollen warnings. So I absolutely think that a physiology report would be welcome. And this goes back towards joining up across different fields and really understanding those impacts. So Mike mentioned immigration and climate refugees. And I think when we think about climate adaptation, when we think about our natural systems in general, we have to think about them as something that's closely tied to the economy, closely tied to national security, as well as just being important areas within their own right. And if, hopefully many of you saw the global ecosystem collapse report that came out a few weeks ago, or a few months ago now. That one really, hopefully, drove home for many people that ecosystem collapse, including that driven by climate change, will impact every sector of this country and is critical for our national security because of some of the impacts that we talked about here. So it's really important that we bring all these different variables together and different sectors together in tackling this issue.
Yeah, and can I just follow up on that, Anjali? Because you were talking about silos and everything, which are a classic Whitehall issue. Obviously, in DEFRA, you're quite heavily involved in this, in the whole climate change and adaptation debate. DESNA's even more. Just tell us how you see what the CST is proposing. How would it change the way you guys work with the more prominent role for Cabinet Office and Number 10?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, I mean, in terms of the recommendations, one of the things that has really held back action on climate adaptation is metrics. Right? So when we think about carbon emissions, that's easy to measure. When we think about things that are harder to measure, biodiversity would be another example of this, nature, the things that we tend to be slower on are the things that we can debate about how to measure it. So I think from my perspective, the most useful things here is about having agreed metrics, agreed targets, and a shared spatial dashboard. I think that would be absolutely transformational in us making real progress in this issue.
Very interesting. Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, on sea level rise, you're absolutely right that this is a process which will continue for centuries. That's locked in. The IPCC doesn't predict very much in 2300, but it does predict what the sea levels will be. Because they will continue to go up. But there is a big difference, and this again comes back to mitigation in terms of, on those timescales, what sea level rise we will see, depending on when we arrive at net zero. In terms of how we adapt to that, I did led some work on the adaptation committee. Actually, it was published in 2016, and in that work, I really talked about the coast in three categories. On the one hand, you've got the highly built-up urban areas, and those places, basically, one's going to have to keep on protecting, and you will spend more and more on adaptation. At the other extreme are basically sparsely or uninhabited places, and those coastal landforms are actually resilient to climate change. Habitats, landforms roll back with a rising sea level. What we have to do is provide them with the space in order to adapt as they have done ever since the end of the last ice age. The tricky bit is the bit in the middle, those coastal towns and villages where analysis is showing that it's becoming unaffordable to protect many of them. And the Victorians were inveterate seawall and promenade builders. Those are structures which are going to be too costly to maintain and replace. And that is where, as Rachel has said, there need to be those honest conversations around what the future holds in terms of when those places need to be adapted. Just a quick word on the private sector. I mean, we're seeing the impacts of this in particular in the United States in terms of seafront communities becoming uninvestable, the cost of the federal insurance system basically becoming unaffordable. So that is sending very clear signals in terms of what needs to happen with respect to adaptation. But having said that, I mean, the private sector is not the entire solution here. We know, as Mark Carney said, the private sector suffers from the tragedy of horizons. We're talking about a long-term process here, and we can't always trust the private sector to think for the long term. And in many senses, we're talking about public goods as well, and there's a fundamental role for government to show leadership in that context.
Emma Howard-Boyd asked about this sort of strange, slightly slow-motion interaction with the CST's letters going in and the replies coming back. Can you shed any light on that and give any further indication of what kind of reaction you've had from government?
There are civil servants from DEFRA in the audience who may wish to help to respond. What I can say is that we know that government is working on adaptation objectives, which will become part of the next National Adaptation Plan. And so in that sense, that does help to answer our recommendation with respect to targets. Frankly, it would have, the government had an opportunity to expand a bit more on what it is actually doing. And we're looking forward to understanding more about that.
Diplomatic answer. Right, let's collect some questions from this side of the room now. Again, there's a group there, and then we'll go back. Yeah, I think there's 2 or 3 of them.
Steve Barry from Climate Essentials. Many cities in the UK have declared net zero by 2050. In order to do that, you need a data intelligence platform. It's a very complicated subject. You've got the council with its assets, you've got a supply chain, you've got SMEs, and you've got households in the region, if you will. Our own client base for Climate Essentials was 25 cities going to 50. It's now 6. So central government's cut off most of the money to councils. Hundreds of people have been let go. So I'm just curious, how are we going to reach the SMEs, supply chain, and households with that type of attitude?
Right, very clear. Then I think immediately behind you, there's another question.
Hello, Richard Barker from National Physical Laboratory. I've got 2 questions, one for Mike and Jim. First one is around human physiology. Obviously, humans have the advantage that we can look to innovation as a way of trying to deal with things. If we take a systems view, you might then pose the question, are nature's and biosystem thresholds and limits actually more critical because they don't have this tool called innovation? So that was one question. Second one, last month there was a very good workshop between the climate science community and the risk management industry. And one of the things that came out of that, which I think relates to the dashboard, because the climate science community were very keen to say, look, what do we need to do for you guys to pay more attention to the science? And one of the issues that came out is that they tend to work to very short-term time horizons. And anything that has a dashboard of climate information isn't going to change much from year to year. And so therefore we have an attention problem. So I'll be interested in, if we have a dashboard and it doesn't change much, how much do we think that's going to create action?
Right. And then I think, yes, right at the back. Let's greet the person there, yeah.
Hiya, thanks. Claire Thornton, FST Council. It feels like the common view amongst the panel is that adaptation action is not urgent enough. But I guess is government policy and the UK's global leadership position in terms of those things, is what we're doing bold enough? So my question is really, is there hope?
Wow. I think I'm going back to Rachel, to start with you and your overview, and there's some very particular challenges there, both, in reality about areas such as local government, and then that final challenge.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the details of what you're talking about in terms of cuts and cities, but I mean, that cities and towns and counties and local government are on the front line of this is obviously a statement of the obvious. I think when it comes in particular to resilience and adaptation, then their ability to be able to, from the bottom up, understand and map risks and the vulnerabilities, but from a human perspective, from a nature perspective, from an infrastructure perspective. So, I mean, we've got a broader problem in this country around the relationship, the funding relationship between local authorities and central government. It's not a new issue. It's been an issue for 20, 30 years. And that I think, in my mind, that's an additional vulnerability, is that we haven't got that system worked out very well for the next 20 to 30 years when you think about climate adaptation being one of the great risks that we're running in terms of our productivity and our growth and our well-being. So a longer conversation, I'm sure, but that's just an instinctive reaction to what you said. Just on the attention problem, but there are parts of the private sector that have a very, very good view over the short, medium and long-term risk, and they're called the quants that sit behind the reinsurers. And they have better data than anybody does. And what we're working on, and actually we will host the G20 in 2020, next year, 2027. And one of the things that we're discussing at the moment is what could we do as the UK in terms of moving the insurance conversation, not just around new products and services and new gadgets and new this and that, but actually start having the conversation about the fact that we are not regulating the insurance industry to be fit for the future in the middle of a climate crisis. So if more states, if the majority of states in the United States of America are now states where you can't get home insurance, right? And we're starting to see uninsurability become an increasing issue in the United Kingdom. And when you get to the EU and you see that only 25% of physical assets which are impacted or vulnerable to climate change are insured, we're starting to have a systemic problem. And certainly central banks and others want to talk about that. Now, they're not going to open the kimono and let everybody see the data that they have, but creating the spaces where we can have an honest conversation. So I think there are instances where the private sector actually can look around the corner. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing a crescendo of voice from the insurance industry, as Emma was referring to, about the fact that we are running systemic risks. So I'm hoping that that's one area where the private sector and government will come together domestically and internationally. And then finally, are we being bold enough? No. Frankly, no. I mean, my job as the climate representative is to, in part, help the government understand that in our relationships with other countries, that when we're dealing with these, problems of that go beyond the resolution of any one region or any one state, that sometimes you just have to be bold, right? The incremental approach will not get us there, and somebody has to move first. And if we moved, we wouldn't be alone. And I think where that leadership comes from, where that confidence comes from, is, I think, important, because we spend an awful lot of time worrying about 5 members of Parliament, right? The vast majority of the rest of Parliament, no matter which party they come from, understands that this is a crisis. And then let's have an argument about what we're going to do, but let's not have an argument about whether it's a crisis or not. We should have moved beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mike?
Okay, very quickly, because I'm conscious of time. I'm not going to stop that applause there. Very quickly, so let me start at the back. Yes, there is a problem, and I don't think we link some of the things we see. When I came up from Cornwall, the train went for miles and miles past fields that are now lakes. And you don't link that. People don't link that to climate change. They don't link that problem to climate change. And we could do more to do that. My experience in people in extreme environments is, we put people in conditions that are tough to survive. And when you ask them what made them survive at the end of it, what mental programs they used and approaches they used, it was all about going to do something for the next generation, surviving long enough to help the next generation. And we need to do more linking that. I know people do it, but it's, we can talk more about that later, but I can give you real examples of how that works. Coming to your point, you're absolutely right. It's our intellect that's allowed us. If we were naked sitting here now, well, we wouldn't be sitting here. We'd still be on a fairly narrow band around the equator. So that's intellect driven, and we can adapt in that way. Having said that, we still have limits and thresholds that I discussed earlier, and there is some adaptation. When I go back to Cornwall, I'll take you and I'll show you the trees at 45 degrees that know how to adapt. But the same rule applies. You need to know the limits and the thresholds where those other, species and in nature starts to get into trouble. So you come back to the same central point. You need to know where the danger zones start and where they get, beyond somewhere where you can recover.
And John?
Thanks. I'll just focus in on that the last point that Mike was just talking about in terms of humans versus the ecosystems, and I'll talk mainly about on the ecosystem and nature side. It is absolutely the case that we are going to see different ecosystems than we grew up with, in different environments and different assemblages of animals and plants, etc. The idea that we are going to recover our way back to the 70s, I just go to that because that's when I grew up, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. That's a hard thing for people, I think, to really engage with and accept, but it is the reality that we have to accept. What we need to figure out is how do we have healthy, resilient ecosystems in this changed world. So that means thinking realistically about what different organisms do in their environment, where are the areas where we are going to lose function and see ecosystem collapse, and what we can do to address that, while also being realistic about the fact that they are going to be different, inevitably. And why they're going to be different, and what that means for us, I think, is really important. So why do we need resilient ecosystems? Now, we can argue about it from the, protecting nature perspective, which I'm very happy to do. I obviously love nature. I'm a biologist. But the truth is, I'm not worried about nature. I'm an evolutionary biologist. We've been through a lot of mass extinctions. Nature will come through the other side of it looking very, very differently than it does now, but it will. I worry about what happens to humans when ecosystems collapse, because that is what will be devastating for us, certainly. Nature will find its way through, albeit highly altered. And so what we are working on very heavily within DEFRA, certainly, and I know lots of people around the country are working with us on this, and around the world, this is a huge focus of effort, is thinking about ecosystems from the perspective of resilience, and moving away from the way that we probably have been approaching this until now, which is how do we keep things exactly the way that they have always been. But just to finish on the last point and towards the back, is there a reason to hope? I mean, if there isn't, then what else do we have? So we absolutely have to hope, and we have to do more than hope. We actually have to just, corral all these people that we have this conversation with and actually push action forward.
Thank you for moving on from the mass extinctions point.
It gives you a weird perspective
I
on
know,
life,
it's
really.
fascinating. Very interesting, I think. Jim.
Yeah, I'll just come in on the question about the dashboard and whether that's going to be exciting enough. In a sense, you're right that we don't expect our projections of climate risk to change enormously from year to year. Risk is a statistical description, and that is the climate is changing through time in not a completely steady way, but more or less. In fact, right now, we probably have a bit too much variation in risk estimates. If we look, for example, at the National Flood Risk Assessment in England, there was one version of that, and then another version was published, and some of the numbers are really quite different to one another. And then the insurance industry has some numbers as well, and they're also a bit different. So actually, we'd rather be in a world where there's a bit more scientific convergence in terms of our understanding of the risk. I think that's still work in progress. But even if we were rather tediously converged in terms of what the risk is, what I'm saying should be on the dashboard is more than that. First of all, I was emphasizing the importance of learning more from actual events which have happened from year to year and documenting that analysis in a consistent way. And the second thing is that this is here to monitor changes in exposure and adaptation. So how many homes are being built in floodplains? How many homes are well adapted to climate change? How much area is being paved over? How many nature-based solutions are being created each year in order to help to mitigate flood risk? I mean, maybe not. That's not for everyone. It's not as exciting as following the Premier League, but that is crucial information to monitor from year to year to tell us exactly what is going on.
Yeah. I'm just going to try to squeeze in, if they're quick. I think there were some other questions that people had their hands up. Yes, let's try to get in the couple down the central aisle there. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you and good evening. So I'm Stu Wainwright, the Chief Exec of CEH. So we're the UK's National Institute for the Science of Land, Water and Air. We're doing an increasing amount of work in this space. But prior to taking this job, I worked in government for over 20 years on resilience and security. So I've seen it from both sides. I think the CST report is great, but we're hearing that the government response is likely to be short. But ministers' jobs are getting harder and harder in the current world, and government officials' jobs are getting harder and harder and faster. So how can this community help them crack on this? They've got challenges around enough of societal understanding, political consensus, and the sheer complexity and the silos within Whitehall. So what can this community do to help government deal with that?
Thank you very much. And I think there's another question just ahead of you. Yeah.
Hi, Jane Gate from Airtow. Just interested to know what the panel thinks about the scale of the challenge that the NHS is facing in the UK with this issue and the extent to which enough, planning processes are in place. And I'm particularly thinking about some of the other challenges that we face, so the rising rates of obesity, ageing population, which will impact on the ability of individuals to thermoregulate.
Yeah. And then let's move forward. Yes. There.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Watts. I'm Executive Director at the Wellcome Trust, but formerly a CSA in FCDO. So similarly seen both sides. Actually, I liked what you said about how tough it is for civil servants, for politicians currently. And just how do you get urgency? We started to talk about the sort of what is the economic case, essentially, but I'm just wondering, is there work, has there been work about, actually, if you think about the metrics of adaptation, the sort of investments that might be required to give resilience, you know, has that economic argument been worked through? There's some bit of a reflection of it's a sort of long-term benefit and a short-term cost, but actually if you look at the impacts we're already facing, including in health, there must be immediate returns as well. And clearly if you're going to go into any spending review, you need to be able to express what is that return on investment. So just has the economic kind of graft that really needs to be done if you're going to get investments being done, or is that one of the gaps that needs to be filled?
Let's now get sort of final comments from our panel, and I'm going to start with Anjali. And partly because you are working so closely with ministers, and particularly, I guess, Emma Reynolds is very aware of all these issues. But then the wider challenge, just how you, as a chief science advisor, help sustain departmental and governmental focus on these type of issues.
Sure. Well, look, it's not easy. As Stu said there, and Stu has spent more time in DEFRA than I have, there are a lot of competing pressures, and the timeline for people wanting to see a return on effort on investment is much shorter than what we will often see in adaptation, certainly. But I think going to Charlotte's point about the economic benefits, I think one thing that certainly I think we try to do at DEFRA and I think across government is we have very clear government missions. And that is helpful because it means we understand exactly what the priorities are. And I think from the perspective of climate adaptation, as all of us have really said, climate adaptation impacts all of this. It will absolutely impact economic growth. On the long term, obviously it will, because it will, not adapting to the climate will cost us immensely in terms of GDP, as well as many other factors that are less easily measured. But on the nearer term, we can lead on new businesses, on supporting new businesses that can grow in this space, that can fill a need that we're going to need internationally. It can also help us, we can support innovation in this space, which we absolutely have to do as well. Now I think there's a lot of things we can do in climate adaptation that don't require innovation exactly, so there are a lot of nature-based solutions, but we absolutely will need some innovation, especially in areas like infrastructure, et cetera. So those are some of the things that we can use to tie climate adaptation directly to the priorities of government and those missions to make sure it is consistently being brought forward as not a side thing, something that is, we can push off until later. If you want to accomplish these missions, this has to be a part of that action story. So in terms of what people can do to help us, obviously there's a lot of work to do, and as we said, government can lead, but it does require people to work at the local level and across different sectors. One of the things, in addition to what we've kind of already said, that I think is really important is what Rachel talked about early on in terms of the politicization of climate. And certainly climate change and mitigation. I think anything that everyone can do to really work against these issues becoming part of a culture war is helpful. And what that means to me is, when acting on it, talking about it not just from the perspective of the negative perspective, but in terms of the opportunity that this affords countries, people, companies, but also making sure that you're having those conversations not just with people who agree with you, and I assume that many of the people who are in this room are kind of on the same page in here, but making sure to have those conversations with people that don't have the same perspective, because until everybody, or at least the majority, really understands the pressure of this, we will not see action, and if it goes down the road of becoming a culture change, a culture war issue, then we will have a much harder time seeing progress here. It affects everybody. Everybody will benefit from climate adaptation, and we need to have everybody involved in the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Mike, your comments.
Sure. Very briefly pick up on the risk and the workload on the NHS, which will undoubtedly increase. But it's not just the NHS, it'll be other aspects, it'll be mental health and wellbeing services will also be increasing, because that's part and parcel of what happens. And what do you do about it? Well, I talk about adaptation in the physiological sense, which is people changing their behaviour, people changing their lifestyles and being prepared to do that. And before they'll do that, they've got to see the benefit of it, and they've got to know why they're doing it and, you know, the real reason for it. And it's only through those adaptations, and we've historically engaged in behavioural adaptation time and time again through our evolution, and it's now time for us to do it again in terms of, you know, what we eat, how we behave, the level of health and fitness that we maintain, and understanding the physiological basis of all of that. So that for me is a different aspect of adaptation that we'll have to see happen.
Thank you. Rachel, and I'm going to add an extra online question, if I may, because it relates so much to your very powerful opening remarks.
Naughty. Okay.
And it's, in a recent analysis of the media in the UK, the tone regarding efforts to adapt has tipped into a greater than 50% negative coverage. How did we get here, and how to change? I mean, in a way, it also follows on from what Anjali was saying. Your final observations on that battle.
Well, I've got a whole treatise on the cynicism of the British press, but I'll spare you all that one. But I actually do think we have a significant systemic problem there, and which we can only collectively push back on when we see it. The point I wanted to make in terms of how this community can help is that you produce really outstanding work with 4 clear, actionable recommendations. I mean, hallelujah, only 4, really clear, completely actionable. Just don't, just sink the teeth in and don't let go. Because you're right? Everything's moving at warp speed, government's distracted, the world's getting a little crazy, and there's a lot going on. But there are good officials and well-intentioned ministers that, just simply need to be nudged back to the priority list because other things get in the way. But you don't have to be too nice about it as well. I mean, just be unrelenting. And my observation since joining government is that there was a big hurrah, a few years ago when we hosted COP26, and there were hundreds of people in the centre pulling together the British ability to host the climate talks, etc. And then we let it all go, and then some. And it's really quite astounding, the lack of central coordination. Now, this is a whole-of-government problem, right, climate change, if ever there was one. Right, this impacts every single department of every single ministry of every single part of government. The idea that everybody's just going to go in their own direction is absurd. And so, there have been lots of work's been done, on delivery units, yes or no, what kind of delivery units, who should run them, how and it will continue. But we have to, at some point, settle on the fact that there are missions and there are priorities, and it's very clear in the manifesto and very clear in the messaging going to ministers. And then climate change is effectively the carpet that is being pulled out from underneath the achievement of any of those missions. And will also disrupt and interrupt growth, will interrupt competitiveness, will interrupt the well-being, and on and on and on, right? And so, yes, this is something where you have to have central coordination and where you have to invest in the centre. And so just, don't let go of your 4 recommendations and until you get a response which is one that you're happy with.
Thank you. Jim, let's give the last word to you. You and your letter.
Yeah, and thank you, Rachel, for that, because, going to the question, how do we help ministers and civil servants? I think the starting point here is that, as we've heard in all of the discussion, this is something we just have to keep going at. And other things will go up and down the political agenda. This will hit the headlines when disasters happen. But much of the time, this is just a kind of simple role for government, working with its partners in the private sector and communities and so on, and just keeping going, which is what government should be doing. And I don't think ministers should be afraid of that. as Angelia said, there is an innovation and growth story here. I work very closely with the Dutch in adaptation, and I think the Dutch have done a much better job of creating an innovation, knowledge economy ecosystem around pitching what they've learned about adaptation. We live in a more complicated country in some senses, and so I think we have a lot to share from our perspective. And in many senses, for many years, the UK has been quite highly regarded, for example, by the OECD in terms of the steps it's taken on adaptation. So there is a success story there in that sense. More fundamentally, in relation to growth, we know that climate shocks will hit growth and will be a chronic drag on growth. And if we look at the investments that are taking place in flood risk management, these are schemes with benefit cost ratios of 4-to-1 or 7-to-1, and so much higher than many other things that go on across government. And similarly, if we look at investments in water resources, the National Infrastructure Commission looked very carefully at what the impacts would be of a prolonged drought in London, and decided that actually investing in water resources was a much more economically beneficial thing to do. So the economic argument is there. And I mean, the UK has the capacity here to do this. There's a strong science base and knowledge base. There's a strong industrial base. We have good policy frameworks, which are well regarded around the world. And in a sense, there's, as I said before, there's nothing particularly new here, though we should be looking to innovation and technology to help us. But we can get on with this. It requires, however, some careful prioritization, making the arguments, acting in a sustained way, monitoring and continuing to learn and communicate.
Very good. Well, look, thank you so much to our 4 speakers. We're very grateful to you. Thank you particularly to our 2 sponsors, the Physiological Society, and we have been educated on the impact on the human body of climate change. And thank you also to the Council for Science and Technology and that punchy letter with those 4 very clear action points. There's a very strong mood to support that, and thank you for the work that went into that important message to the government. And above all, thank you to our participants. Thank you very much for our online participants and also to people with us here at the Royal Society this evening. And we can now adjourn for a glass of wine, dinner at 8 o'clock, and there will be opportunities for more exchange and Q&A for a brief time after dinner. Thank you very much indeed.
Ideas that they might like to adopt.